Tony Bennett stared at himself in the mirror of the small makeup trailer parked behind St. Patrick's Cathedral, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. The prosthetic makeup was extraordinary. His face had been aged even beyond his actual 97 years, his skin given a waxy, lifeless pallor that made him look genuinely deceased. Grey contact lenses clouded his usually bright eyes, and the special effects team had even created subtle bruising and discoloration that suggested a body that had been prepared by a funeral home. "Jesus, Dominic," Tony whispered to the makeup artist who had spent the last 3 hours transforming him. "You've made me look like I actually died." Dominic Castellano, a 45-year-old special effects wizard who normally worked on horror movies, stepped back to admire his work. "That's the point, Mr. Bennett. When you asked me to make you look dead for your own funeral, I thought you were having some kind of breakdown, but this is going to be the performance of your lifetime." Tony had conceived this elaborate plan 6 months earlier, during one of his increasingly rare lucid moments as Alzheimer's slowly stole his memories. He wanted to know what people really thought about him, what they would say when they believed he couldn't hear them anymore. The official story was that Tony Bennett had suffered a sudden heart attack in his sleep. The funeral had been planned by his estate manager, Patricia Williams, who was the only person alive who knew that the body in the closed casket was actually filled with sandbags and flowers. "Remember," Dominic said, applying a final touch of mortuary makeup to Tony's hands, "you're dead. No reactions, no matter what you hear. Dead people don't flinch, they don't smile, they don't cry. You're going to hear things that will shock you, things that will hurt you, things that will make you want to jump up and defend yourself. But you have to stay absolutely still." Tony nodded, then caught himself. "Even dead people don't nod," he said with a weak smile. "This is going to be harder than I thought." The plan was intricate. Tony would be positioned in a wheelchair in the back corner of the cathedral, disguised as an elderly mourner who had arrived early and fallen asleep. The lighting in that corner was dim enough that even close friends wouldn't recognize him under the makeup. Patricia had arranged for a distant cousin to claim the sleeping mourner as their responsibility, ensuring that no one would try to wake him or move him to a better seat. As Dominic put the finishing touches on Tony's disguise, they could hear the sounds of people beginning to arrive at the cathedral. Cars pulling up, doors slamming, the low murmur of conversations as New York's elite gathered to pay their respects to one of the last great American entertainers. "Mr. Bennett," Dominic said quietly, "are you sure you want to do this? Once we wheel you in there, once people start talking, you can't take back what you're going to hear." Tony considered the question for the 100th time in the past week. He was dying, not today, not tomorrow, but soon enough. The Alzheimer's was progressing faster than his doctors had predicted. Within a year, maybe less, he wouldn't remember his own name, let alone the conversations he was about to witness. This was his last chance to understand how he would be remembered, to hear the truth that people only spoke about the dead. "I need to know, Dominic. I need to know who mourns me and who celebrates. I need to know what my life really meant to the people who knew me." Dominic nodded and began wheeling Tony toward the cathedral's side entrance. "Then let's go find out what people really think of Tony Bennett." The interior of St. Patrick's Cathedral was magnificent, filled with the kind of flowers that cost more than most people's cars, and attended by faces that Tony recognized from decades of entertainment industry events, political gatherings, and social functions. The guest list read like a who's who of American culture. Aging entertainers who had worked with Tony, business executives who had profited from his music, politicians who had used his celebrity for their own purposes, and family members whose relationships with Tony were more complicated than the public knew. Dominic positioned Tony's wheelchair in the designated corner, adjusting his posture to look like an elderly man who had dozed off during the pre-service gathering. From this vantage point, Tony could see almost the entire cathedral while remaining virtually invisible to the mourners, who were more focused on seeing and being seen than on noticing one sleeping old man in a wheelchair. The first shock came within minutes of his arrival. Tony's own nephew, Michael Bennett Jr., was standing near the altar with a group of family members, speaking in what he clearly thought was a private conversation, but which carried clearly to Tony's enhanced hearing. Dominic had fitted him with nearly invisible hearing aids tuned to amplify distant conversations. "Well, at least we won't have to pretend anymore," Michael was saying to his sister Catherine. The old man was getting embarrassing toward the end. The Alzheimer's, the confusion, showing up to events in his pajamas. It was time. Catherine nodded agreement. The estate settlement should be straightforward now. Did you see what Patricia estimated the music catalogue is worth? We're looking at hundreds of millions once the posthumous releases start. Tony felt his heart stop, not literally, but the emotional impact was devastating. His own family, people he had supported financially for decades, people whose children's educations he had funded, were already calculating their inheritance while his body was supposedly still warm. But then he heard something that confused him even more. "Michael, Catherine, I need to speak with you both, privately." The voice belonged to Harold Morgenstern, Tony's longtime lawyer, and one of the few people who had been genuinely surprised by Tony's sudden death. Tony watched as Harold led his nephew and niece into a small side chapel, their voices dropping to whispers that even his enhanced hearing couldn't catch. Whatever Harold was telling them was making them both increasingly agitated. Michael's face went pale, and Catherine began shaking her head vigorously. Before Tony could process what he had witnessed, another conversation drew his attention. Tony Bennett was the greatest talent of his generation, but he was also the most naive man I ever worked with. The speaker was David Hirsch, Tony's former manager from the 1970s and 80s. He was talking to a small group of industry executives, including several people who had made fortunes managing Tony's career and licensing his music. "Naive how?" asked Maria Santos, a music executive from Sony. Tony actually believed that art mattered more than business. He turned down deals that would have made him twice as wealthy because he thought they compromised his artistic integrity. "In 40 years of managing entertainers, I never worked with anyone who left so much money on the table for the sake of principle." The group laughed, not unkindly, but with the condescension of people who measured success purely in financial terms. "Still," said another executive, "his principles made him marketable to an older demographic that had money to spend." The whole integrity thing was actually good branding. Tony felt a cold rage building in his chest. These people had presented themselves as his friends, his artistic collaborators, his partners in creating music that would last. But they had seen him as nothing more than a product to be managed and monetized. His artistic principles hadn't been respected, they had been exploited as a marketing strategy. But the real shock was yet to come. As the formal service began, Tony watched a woman enter the cathedral who shouldn't have been there. Angela Torelli was 78 years old, elegantly dressed in black, and moving with the careful dignity of someone who had spent decades carrying a secret. She had been Tony's lover for 12 years, from 1985 to 1997, a relationship that had nearly destroyed his marriage and had been hidden from the public with extraordinary care. Angela took a seat in the middle of the cathedral, surrounded by strangers, her face composed but her hands trembling slightly. Tony hadn't seen her in over 20 years, not since the night she had given him an ultimatum. Leave his wife Susan, or end their relationship forever. Tony had chosen his marriage, and Angela had disappeared from his life so completely that he had sometimes wondered if their relationship had been a dream. Now she was here, at his funeral, mourning publicly for a relationship that had officially never existed. Father Michael O'Connor, the priest conducting the service, began the eulogy with the standard biographical details: Tony's birth in Queens, his military service, his rise to fame, his multiple marriages, his philanthropic work. It was the sanitized version of his life that would appear in newspaper obituaries and encyclopedia entries. But then Father O'Connor said something that made Tony's blood freeze. Tony Bennett lived a life of public grace and private struggle. Like many entertainers of his generation, he fought battles with addiction, with temptation, and with the weight of secrets that fame requires its practitioners to carry. Tony had never discussed his personal struggles with Father O'Connor. The priest was speaking as if he knew things about Tony's life that Tony had never shared with anyone outside his immediate family. How was that possible? The answer came in the next part of the eulogy. Before his death, Tony asked me to share something with you that he had never been able to say publicly. Tony Bennett struggled with alcohol addiction for nearly 30 years, from the late 1960s through the late 1990s. His recovery was one of his greatest private victories, and he wanted his struggle to be known so that it might help others who face similar battles. Tony's mind reeled. He had never asked Father O'Connor to reveal his addiction history. He had never even met with the priest to plan his funeral. Someone else had provided that information, someone who knew intimate details about his life that he had shared with very few people. But who and why? As the eulogy continued, Tony began to understand that this funeral was not what it appeared to be. Someone had orchestrated not just his fake death, but a fake funeral designed to reveal secrets, settle scores, and expose truths that Tony himself didn't understand. The question was, who? The answer came from an unexpected source. As mourners began to approach the podium to share memories, Tony's ex-wife Patricia Beach stepped forward. She was 84 now, still beautiful, still carrying herself with the grace that had first attracted Tony when they were both young and ambitious in the 1950s. Tony and I were married for 11 years, Patricia began, her voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's acoustics. They were wonderful years and terrible years, sometimes simultaneously. Tony was a man of extraordinary gifts and extraordinary flaws. She paused, looking directly at the area where Tony sat disguised in his wheelchair. For a terrifying moment, he thought she had recognized him, but she continued speaking to the larger congregation. Tony never knew this, but I hired private investigators to follow him for the last 15 years of our marriage. I know about Angela Torelli. I know about the drinking. I know about the gambling debts he hid from his business managers. I know about the abortion he paid for in 1969 for a backup singer whose name I won't mention out of respect for her family. The cathedral fell silent. Tony felt like he was having a heart attack. Patricia knew things that even he had forgotten, details from the worst periods of his life that he had buried so deeply that they rarely surfaced, even in his nightmares. "I'm not sharing these details to hurt Tony's memory," Patricia continued. "I'm sharing them because Tony spent his entire life afraid that people would stop loving him if they knew who he really was. He never understood that we loved him not despite his flaws, but because he was human enough to have them and strong enough to overcome most of them." Patricia returned to her seat, but the damage was done. Tony could see people throughout the cathedral whispering, processing revelations about his life that recontextualized everything they thought they knew about him. But the biggest revelation was yet to come. Susan Bennett, Tony's widow, stepped to the podium with an expression that Tony had never seen before, calm, determined, and slightly frightening in its intensity. Most of you knew. My husband is Tony Bennett, the entertainer. Some of you knew him as Anthony Benedetto, the man. But there are things about Tony that no one in this room knows, except me. Things that died with him yesterday morning. Susan pulled a letter from her purse and unfolded it carefully. Tony wrote this letter 6 months ago when he was first diagnosed with Alzheimer's. He asked me to read it at his funeral if he died before losing his ability to communicate. This is Tony's final message to all of you. Tony's heart pounded. He had never written such a letter. Susan was improvising, or worse, someone had written a fake letter and convinced her it was authentic. Susan began to read. My friends, if Susan is reading this, it means I'm gone and she's honoring my final request. I want you to know that I spent my entire career pretending to be someone I wasn't. The gentleman jazz singer, the classy entertainer, the man who rose above the corruption of the music industry. That was a character I played, not the man I really was. Tony wanted to scream. He had never written those words, never felt that way about his career or his public image. Someone was putting words in his mouth, literally speaking for him from beyond the fake grave. The letter continued. I made deals with dangerous people. I compromised my principles when it benefited me financially. I hurt people who loved me and I betrayed people who trusted me. The Tony Bennett you're mourning today was a fiction. The real Anthony Benedetto was weak, selfish, and afraid. Susan folded the letter and looked out at the congregation. Tony wanted you to know the truth about him because he believed that honesty was the only way to earn genuine forgiveness. Tony finally understood what was happening. This wasn't his funeral, it was his trial. Someone had orchestrated this entire event to expose every secret, every failure, every compromise he had ever made. Someone wanted to destroy his legacy in front of everyone who had ever admired him. But who would know all these details about his life? Who would have access to information from his ex-wives, his former managers, his private confessors? The answer was sitting in the front row, dressed in black and crying convincing tears. Patricia Williams, his estate manager, the only person who knew he was still alive. Patricia had been with Tony for 20 years, managing his finances, scheduling his appointments, handling his correspondence. She had access to everything: his personal papers, his medical records, his tax returns, his legal documents. She knew about every payment he had ever made, every secret he had ever paid to keep buried, every person who had ever had leverage over him. But why would Patricia want to destroy him? The answer came during her own eulogy. Patricia approached the podium with tears in her eyes and a tremor in her voice that suggested overwhelming grief. Tony Bennett was more than my employer, she began. He was my mentor, my father figure, and for the past 5 years, my husband in everything but legal documentation. Tony's world collapsed. Patricia continued. Tony couldn't marry me officially because of the complications with his estate and his family's inheritance claims. But we exchanged private vows in 2019. We lived as husband and wife, and he promised me that I would be taken care of after his death. She pulled out a document that Tony could see even from his distant corner was an official-looking will. Unfortunately, Tony's family has challenged our relationship and my inheritance. They claim that Tony wasn't mentally competent to make decisions about his estate during his final years. They claim that I manipulated a sick old man for financial gain. Patricia's tears were genuine now, and Tony realized with horror that she actually believed what she was saying. Somewhere in her care for him, her affection had transformed into delusion. She had convinced herself that their professional relationship was romantic, that his gratitude was love, that his dependence was commitment. "This funeral," Patricia continued, "is my way of proving that Tony trusted me with everything, his secrets, his flaws, his true self. He gave me the authority to tell his story honestly, to share details that only a wife would know. Tony loved me enough to trust me with his legacy." Tony understood now. Patricia had discovered his plan to fake his death, but instead of stopping him, she had turned it into an opportunity to expose him completely. She believed that by revealing all his secrets, she was proving their intimate relationship to his family and to the courts that would decide his estate. She had turned his desire to hear honest eulogies into a public destruction of everything he had spent 70 years building. But as Tony sat in his wheelchair, disguised as a corpse, listening to the systematic demolition of his reputation, he felt something unexpected: relief. For 70 years he had been terrified that people would discover his flaws, his mistakes, his human weaknesses. He had spent enormous energy maintaining a public image that was cleaner, more noble, and more consistent than any real person could actually be. Now, all of his secrets were being exposed at once, in the most public venue possible, and the world hadn't ended. People weren't fleeing the cathedral in disgust. They were listening, processing, and, in many cases, nodding with understanding. The conversations he could overhear suggested that many people had suspected some of these things about him, and his openness was making him more relatable, not less. "I always wondered how he stayed so clean in such a dirty business," he heard one industry executive whisper to another. "Now it makes sense. He was just better at hiding it than the rest of us." "The addiction explains so much about his music from the 1970s, another voice said. "The pain in his voice during that period, it was real." As the service continued, Tony began to understand that Patricia had inadvertently given him a gift. She had freed him from the exhausting burden of maintaining a perfect public image. She had revealed his humanity in a way that made people love him more, not less. But there was still the question of what to do about Patricia herself, and about the inheritance battle that was apparently raging over his fake corpse. The answer came during the final hymn, when Angela Torelli, his former lover, stood up and walked directly to where Tony sat in his wheelchair. She leaned down and whispered directly in his ear. "I know it's you, Anthony. The makeup is good, but I know your hands. I've been watching you react to everything that's been said." Tony's eyes widened slightly, the first reaction he had shown in 3 hours. "Don't worry," Angela continued quietly. "Your secret is safe with me, but we need to talk after this service ends. There are things about Patricia Williams that you don't know. Things that will shock you even more than this funeral has." As the service concluded and mourners began filing out of the cathedral, Angela positioned herself near Tony's wheelchair, playing the role of a concerned stranger helping an elderly mourner who seemed confused and disoriented. "Come with me," she whispered. "We need to get you out of here before Patricia realizes what you've discovered." 20 minutes later, Tony was sitting in Angela's apartment on the Upper East Side, still wearing his death makeup, but finally able to move and speak freely. "Angela," he said, his voice hoarse from hours of forced silence. "How did you know?" "I've been watching you for 20 years, Anthony. Not following you, not stalking you, but paying attention. When Patricia announced your death, something felt wrong. The timing, the circumstances, the way she seemed almost excited about planning the funeral. So I did some investigating." Angela pulled out a thick folder of documents and photographs. "Patricia Williams isn't who you think she is. Her real name is Patricia Torino. She's Mickey Torino's daughter." Tony's world tilted again. Mickey Torino, the jazz producer who had been rumored to have mob connections, who had died under mysterious circumstances in the 1980s, who had been involved in some of the shadiest deals in the music industry. Patricia has been planning this for years, Angela continued. Not just embezzling from your estate, though she's been doing that too. She's been systematically gathering evidence to destroy your reputation as revenge for what happened to her father. What happened to her father? You testified against him in the federal investigation in 1983. Your testimony helped send him to prison, where he died of a heart attack 6 months later. Patricia was 16 years old when her father died. She spent the next 30 years planning her revenge against everyone who destroyed her family. Angela spread out photographs showing Patricia meeting with various people over the years. Tony's ex-wives, former business associates, journalists, and lawyers. She's been collecting damaging information about you for decades, preparing for this moment when she could destroy your legacy and claim your estate simultaneously. The fake letter, the revelations from your ex-wives, even some of the private conversations you overheard today, they were all orchestrated by Patricia. Tony stared at the evidence, understanding that he had been living with his enemy for 20 years without realizing it. But Anthony, Angela said gently, there's something else, something that might actually be good news. She pulled out a legal document from the bottom of the folder. Patricia's plan had a flaw. In order to claim your estate as your widow, she had to provide evidence of your relationship. But all the evidence she gathered actually proves that she deceived you, manipulated you, and defrauded you. Her own documentation will destroy her legal claims and probably send her to prison. Tony looked at Angela, this woman who had loved him genuinely 40 years ago, who had disappeared from his life completely, and who had now saved him from an elaborate revenge plot. Why are you helping me? After the way our relationship ended, you have every right to hate me. Angela smiled, and for a moment, Tony could see the beautiful young woman he had fallen in love with in the 1980s. Because, Anthony, love doesn't end just because relationships do. I've spent 20 years building a life without you, and I'm happy with that life. But I never stopped caring about your well-being. When I realized what Patricia was doing to you, I couldn't stand by and watch. Over the next 3 hours, Tony and Angela developed a plan that would expose Patricia's deception while minimizing the damage to his reputation. They would reveal that Tony's death had been faked, but frame it as a medical misdiagnosis rather than an intentional deception. Patricia's manipulation would be exposed, and the revelations from the funeral would be dismissed as the fabrications of a disturbed woman seeking attention and money. But as they worked through the details, Tony made a decision that surprised even himself. Angela, what if we don't expose everything? What if we let some of the truth stand? What do you mean? The things Patricia revealed today about my drinking, about my mistakes, about my flaws, most of them were true. I've been carrying shame about those things for decades. Maybe it's time to stop hiding. Angela looked at him carefully. Anthony, are you sure? Once you acknowledge those things publicly, you can't take them back. I'm 97 years old, Angela. I'm dying, whether from Alzheimer's or something else. I don't have time left to waste on maintaining perfect images. Today I learned that people can handle the truth. And about me. Maybe it's time I handled it too. The next morning, Tony Bennett held a press conference that shocked the world. He appeared very much alive to explain that reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated due to a medical emergency that had been misdiagnosed. He confirmed that some of the personal revelations from his funeral had been true, acknowledging his past struggles with addiction and his human failings. But he also exposed Patricia Williams's decades-long deception and her attempts to defraud his estate. The legal consequences for Patricia were swift and severe, not just criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement, but civil liability that would keep her in court for years. More importantly, Tony's honesty about his flaws and his grace in forgiving Patricia's deception created a public response unlike anything in his 70-year career. Instead of condemnation, he received an outpouring of support from people who appreciated his courage in admitting his humanity. 6 months later, Tony Bennett performed one final concert at Carnegie Hall. The performance was dedicated to second chances, honest relationships, and the courage to be imperfect. Angela Torelli was in the audience not as his lover, but as his friend. His family, chastened by their mercenary behavior at his fake funeral, had reconciled with him and committed to supporting him through his final years. And Patricia Williams was serving a 5-year sentence for elder fraud, with plenty of time to reflect on how revenge had destroyed her life more thoroughly than it had ever damaged her intended target. Tony Bennett's fake funeral had become the most honest performance of his career. By pretending to be dead, he had finally learned how to be fully alive. The makeup had washed off, the disguise had been removed, but the freedom that came from having no secrets left to protect remained with him for whatever time he had left. Sometimes the most important audience for a performance is the performer himself, and sometimes the most beautiful music comes from finally having the courage to sing without a mask.